Okay, well, thank you for having me. Don't let me forget, I've got some swag here, so best question asked during or after the talk will win a wireless charging mouse mat, which I brought back from the MVP Summit earlier in the year, and it's been sitting around. I've just been waiting for the opportunity to bring along to the user group, so somebody will go home with that tonight. Apologies to those online. I don't have anything to give you, but thanks for being online. So my name's David Gardiner. I'm a senior developer for 6Pivot. We're a consulting company based in Australia. And tonight, I really want to talk about the reason my hair has gone grey. And it's not just my kids. It's dealing with sort of DevOps-y kind of things, and particularly GitHub and Azure DevOps is probably where I've been focusing a lot of my attention recently, building pipelines and deployments, banging my head against the screen, sort of why did the last thing fail, and yeah, what can I do to make it a bit more reliable? And there's a fly in the room. That's great. Okay, so I've got 10 tips. Hopefully they're interesting, and whilst I'm going to be using GitHub, and there is literally a fly bugging me. That's great. I should put corks on my hat, and then it would keep the fly away. Whilst I'm going to be talking about GitHub and Azure pipelines, if you're using something else like TeamCity or Bitbucket or any other kind of build or deployment, Octopus deploy, any of those kind of systems, I think a lot of these principles will apply. You just have to sort of take the concept and adapt it and see how it makes sense for you. The first tip I have is try and build simple pipelines, sort of simplify things as much as possible, but not too much. And so one way of doing that I'm going to demonstrate is with Azure pipelines. I'm just going to switch the video around and jump over to here. So I've got a repo on GitHub with all of my samples. I'll have a link to that at the end. But essentially what I'm going to show you first of all is I've got a pretty typical Azure pipelines deployment pipeline. So it's using YAML, not using the old classic release pipelines. It's a regular YAML pipeline, and this is using a pipeline trigger. So this would be typically you've done your build, that's finished, and now you are triggering a deployment into different environments. So this is going to run after our build pipeline is finished, and we've got 3 stages: dev, test, and prod. And again, nothing too surprising there. That I'm sure you've probably seen similar sort of setups where we've got 3 environments. Our dev one we're probably deploying to a lot. Test maybe less frequently, and prod maybe even less frequently again, unless you're really organised and doing sort of continuous deployments all the time, which would be awesome. But yeah, so we've got all this, and you might notice there's a bit of repetition there. We've got the same tasks applying to each of our stages. Now, obviously this is pretty simple, but it represents what could be a lot more complicated scenarios for deploying, pushing stuff up into the cloud, configuring things, deploying databases and that kind of stuff. But we're repeating ourselves, and that bugs me. Wouldn't it be nice if we could simplify this a bit? Well, we can. And so Azure Pipelines has this, one of its directives is an each directive. So we can actually collapse all that right down, and it's essentially a for each loop to what we're doing now. We're looping over this thing called environments, and that's defined back up the top here. I've got a parameter called environments. It's a type object, and that's significant, and then we've just given it a default value. Now, if you're familiar with YAML, you might sort of understand that actually when we use a dash here, that's actually kind of creating an array, essentially. So that's what we've done here. We've got an array with, and each item in the array has a property called name, and that the value of that is dev. So indeed, we could add other things in here, like we might have, I don't know, connection string, blah. Other things that are specific to that environment, we can add that in there as well. Not passwords, don't do that. But other things that are sort of relevant to that environment, we can use that there. And then when we're looping around, we can refer to those individual properties. So in this example, I'm just using .name. So I'm using that to define the stage name. It's used in the display name here as well, and even the job under that stage. And likewise, we could use it in individual steps. So we've collapsed that right down. Now, it's worth noting, if we did try and manually run this pipeline, you will see that it's a parameter, and it's kind of the only way we can do this. It's kind of a fudge, but it's pretty much the only way we can include that kind of data in our pipeline. So you will see that as a parameter. Often what I'll do is I'll set a display name here to say, display name, sort of don't touch this. Just as a hint to the person who might be manually running the pipeline, you probably shouldn't be messing with these values because you could cause problems. So yeah, if we have a look at that in our pipelines, and we'll see, so here was our before, and you can see there's our 3 stages, and likewise, if we go to our after, we're still seeing the 3 stages. So the net effect is exactly the same. It just means we've got a simpler pipeline to manage. So that's one that I use quite a lot. You go, okay, but that's fine, but my production, I've actually got to do something extra in production. How do I deal with that? Well, then you can still add some conditional logic in there to say, okay, if environment.name is equal to prod, then include this extra step or an extra job. So an example of that I often see is where I've been working recently. They use the Artifactory service for managing their artifacts. And when they do a production release, that also means they want to promote all the artifacts into a production repository and Artifactory. So that's an extra step we need to do just before we actually do the production release. So using that conditional step in there is a way of handling that. The other thing I want to mention is when we're simplifying pipelines is how we manage variables. So in Azure pipelines, we can define variables in our pipeline in a variable block. We've got variable groups, which are defined in the library. And so here I've got some variable groups here. And that's just a way of defining a variable. We can also include secrets in here as well. And variable groups are good for defining secrets. The downside of variable groups, I think, is that there's not really any traceability here. There's no auditing to say, Pratik changed this value, but what was the value before that? I don't know. Maybe he remembers, but there's no history there. All you get to see is the last person to change the variable group.
Unless you link to a key vault.
Yeah, so if it's backed by a key vault, then the key vault can do that kind of stuff, and that's a great use of a variable group, is either secrets in there or in a key vault, even better. But yeah, all you can see is that I modified it, but if someone else signed in and modified it, you can't tell which one they changed. So for non-secret values, I prefer to see those committed into version control, either as a separate YAML file, or if it's for some other purpose, like, I don't know, Terraform or Bicep, then there's similar files there where they can be committed to version control, and you get all the change history there when they're changed. But obviously don't put secrets in there or passwords. They do belong outside of version control. Likewise for GitHub. So we have the same kind of thing. We've got, here's a GitHub repo, and we've got secrets and variables, and we can define those. We can define them within our GitHub action workflows, but also we can define them here. So again, defining secrets here makes sense. Sometimes we might define a variable here, which is, as it describes, it's basically setting up an environment variable. I do have one set up there for one of my demonstrations. But yeah, be cautious with them. Even with using variables in your pipelines, it's tempting to make everything a variable, but then it just becomes really hard to understand what's going on. So think, is this thing actually going to change, or does it make sense for me to make this a variable? Okay, do it. But if it's just because you're just making everything a variable just in case you might need to change it, well, maybe don't do that. Sort of think about the Yagni, you ain't going to need it. So only make it a variable when you realise, actually, I need to vary this per environment, for example. Then that's a good case for a variable. Okay. Next tip. Don't go crazy with templates. So this is probably more of an Azure Pipelines problem than GitHub Actions, just because GitHub Actions doesn't really have templates as such, but we'll have a look at what you can do in GitHub Actions a bit later on as a separate tip. But what do I mean by that? So I've got, actually my browser, I've got a pipeline here, and the names of my pipelines may give away what I'm trying to demonstrate. If you have a look at this, it's not particularly tricky. It's just got a stage with a job and a few steps in it. Seems pretty benign. Let's actually have a look at how this has been created, and I will suggest that this is, I have seen pipelines like this, and it just makes it really hard to understand what's going on. So I've got a pipeline here, and I'm using the template feature of Azure Pipelines. So first of all, I've got some variables defined in another file. That's reasonable because I might want to reuse those across different pipelines. I'm okay with that. And then I've said, okay, my stages are actually defined in a separate file called stages. So, okay, let's have a look at that one. Here's my stages, and then I've got my jobs in that stage. They're defined in another file. Okay, let's have a look at that one. And I've got my steps defined in another file, and actually it's not this file here. I'm now using a feature where I can actually point to a completely different repo and pull that in to become part of my pipeline. So, and how was that done? That was back up here in the Azure pipeline itself. Under the resources, I've set up a repository resource, which is pointing to a different GitHub repo. And yeah, so I just happen to have that checked out on my computer, so I can show you that that's the source. You're not missing out on too much. It's just got steps in there with a step. But yeah, I've actually seen this, and there may be reasons why you want to do that, especially in a large organisation. You might want to provide some functionality and share that. But there's a cost to that, and I think it's really that it becomes quite hard for you as a maintainer of the pipeline to understand what's going on. It also means that it's a lot more risk. It's just like any other code that is shared, that as soon as you change that template in that other repo, you risk breaking everything. So you're all of a sudden going to be a lot more careful about what changes you make to that. So yeah, question from the audience.
Can you include a tag or a hash?
Yeah, so yes, you can.
Not the ref, yeah.
Yeah. So you can. So the question is, yeah, can you sort of restrict it down to a specific release or a commit? And yes. So that may be something you want to do for exactly that reason, just to reduce the chance that the central IT department or DevOps team break all of your builds because they format the YAML file wrong or something like that. Or yeah, totally possible. Yeah. So you can use that, but be really careful, I think. And I've seen it where I think people tend to overuse it, and it just becomes really hard to understand what's going on here. There's all these templates coming from every different place. It just makes it a lot harder to reason. So yeah, just use that with caution. Okay. That image was supposed to represent complexity. So I thought that they're not too messy, are they? I was kind of looking for more spaghetti kind of.
They needed the templates.
Yeah. Anyway, I tried. Okay. Next one is composite actions. So this is something for GitHub. So GitHub actions don't really have templates as such, but they do have the ability to write your own actions. And it's kind of the way we would achieve the same thing. So here our GitHub actions live up here in this repo under the .github folder. So I've got my build. Now, you can see, if you haven't seen GitHub Actions before and you think, gee, that looks a lot like Azure pipelines, you're right. They do look pretty similar and they do kind of have a common heritage. I guess they're starting to diverge a bit now, but yeah, that's all I'll say about that. Yeah, so this is a build pipeline. We're building something running. It's a .NET application, and we're pushing it to packages. So we can simplify that down. So we've got the ability in GitHub Actions to write our own actions. So if we wanted, the equivalent here is really in Azure DevOps, if I wanted to create a whole new task that I wanted to use, I've got to create an extension, publish that to the marketplace, and then I've got to convince people to install it in their Azure DevOps installation, then they can use it. For GitHub, we can write a custom task and just publish it to GitHub and people can use it straight away, or we can even write it ourselves in our own repo, which is what I've done here. In particular, I'm using a custom, a composite action, which is basically a way of calling other actions in one. So rather than having all those build steps there, I can jump over here and you'll see it looks pretty similar to what we were looking at before. The only difference is we've got a name and a description here of the action. We've just said that it is a composite action because we can create other kinds of actions in GitHub Actions. We can create a Docker action or a Node JS one, or even a PowerShell one for that matter. But in this case, we're just calling out to other existing actions. So we just got our same kind of steps. The only other difference is that I just had to add in for any script task here, I've just had to tell which kind of shell it's running as. So I didn't have to do that. If I jump back to the other one, I haven't had to tell which shell is being used here, but I do have to do that, in the composite action. The other difference I had to make this work is that previously in the build, I'm referring to the GitHub token. So this is kind of like the token that the action has itself if it needs to talk to GitHub. If I wanted to, and so I'm using it here because I'm publishing a NuGet package to the GitHub packages repository. To do the same thing in the action, that doesn't work. But instead, I do have access to the context property GitHub. And so if I want to refer to the token, I have just to change the way I do that there. So just a little thing to be aware of. But yeah, other than that, it's pretty similar. And that means I've now got this. I could reuse that in different workflows within the same project. If I then realize, actually, this is really useful for a number of projects, I could then pull it out of here and use it and create it as a whole complete separate action. So quite powerful. It would be so nice if Azure Pipelines had that kind of feature too, but I don't see that coming anytime soon, unfortunately. Next tip, adopt a good security posture. And I guess there's a couple of things here I want to have a look at is taking advantage of sort of security scanning services and operating the least privilege. So let's look at the security scanning services first. So GitHub probably has a better story here. There's a whole lot of third-party and first-party tools we can make use of here. If I jump back to my browser. So we can set a lot of this stuff up by going to code security analysis. And there's stuff here we can enable. We'll come back to Dependabot, but there's code scanning here. I can turn on CodeQL analysis, which is a static analysis tool that GitHub provide. I can also add other third-party tools. And if I click on that, there's a whole bunch of third-party scanning tools here that I can add. And if I click on configure, it'll create a new workflow that'll launch that tool and run it against my repository. So this is like checking to see if you've accidentally put a password in your code when you don't want to do that. You might be doing SQL injection and you really shouldn't be doing that either. So static analysis tools can sort of scan for that. You can also do things like if you're building Docker images, you want to scan those to make sure you haven't included any sort of vulnerabilities that you're not even aware of. I've been looking at one recently with a package that was referencing an old NuGet package, which turns out there was a vulnerability in that. So we're trying to upgrade that to a newer one. So these are all a bunch of different tools. Some of them are free. A lot of them you may have to have a subscription for, or you might at least have to sign up for to try out. And then you get a whole bunch of stuff. So if I go into here to security, and I can actually see, okay, there's nothing there. Oh, sorry, here we are, code scanning. So I've set up a few of these in this repo. Oh, that one didn't work very well, but there's some of these. Some of these are just like just formatting kind of things, but some of them could be security issues as well. So take advantage of those. While we're here, we'll also talk about configuring some of the other stuff, which is like, actually no, I'll come back to that. In Azure Pipelines, we've got less options here for scanning. I guess there's some third-party options you can choose. There is the GitHub Advanced Security for Azure Pipelines, which is a subscription service you need to pay for. I won't talk about that too much because I think that's going to be covered a bit next month. But yeah, be aware that exists. Likewise, that obviously exists for GitHub as well. But yeah, I guess the better options there are the ones you need to pay for. The second point about security was least privilege. So in Azure Pipelines, there's a few settings we can use there to make sure that we're not just letting everything run all the time. So when we're creating a service connection, which we can see in here, and this is where we want to access some other resource, like it might be an Azure subscription, or in this case, it's talking to a GitHub repo. Some of these can be set up and the default is, oh yeah, let everything run. But that's probably not great. Really what you want is to say, no, I want to know the first time somebody creates a new pipeline, they want to rely on this, I want to be able to approve that. So then you get a little prompt saying, this needs to be approved. And once it's approved, then it can use it. But so you've got that sort of visibility that, John's added a new pipeline and he wants to access the production key vault, but hang on, this pipeline, it's not for production, and why is it called trying to find all the company secrets.yaml? That looks a bit suspicious to me. I might go and have a chat with John and ask what he's up to. Maybe there's a legitimate reason for doing that, I don't know. But yeah, not just having everything open, but requiring that as well. On the GitHub side, we've got something a bit interesting there. We've actually got the ability to really be quite explicit about what permissions our pipeline runs with. So if I go back to, which one? Oh, it's the Codacy one. So this is a pipeline that runs the Codacy tool, which is going to scan for security things. And what you can do is add a permission statement here to say, actually, this workflow is only allowed to read the Git contents, like the Git files in version control. But sometimes you don't know what permissions the workflow needs, because you might be calling out to some other tasks and you don't really know what they need. You can run it and it fails, you think, oh, I'm going to guess it might need this one. There is actually a tool that GitHub have written. You can include that here, which I've got here. It's like adding this step, and then it'll basically set up a little proxy inside the workflow, and it'll try and figure out what permissions you're wanting to use. So I did that, and if we have a look at the action that I ran, that one, then hopefully, so down here we've got this little thing to say actually the only permissions we think, and it's not always right but it's pretty close, is you need permission to write to this particular thing here. So if I add that in, then that means yeah, that's all I should need. Interestingly, they've got a few other ones here in the example, but I should be able to add that in, and then it should work. And I think the reason it wants that security events is because it is writing security data back to the GitHub project. But yeah, so locking things down, again, means that you're less risk that, because I'm using these actions, that if I then upgrade the action and somebody, again, John, being sneaky, he's hacked into, I don't know, this particular action here. He's somehow managed to commit a new change and he's trying to do Bitcoin mining in there. But maybe the permissions I've set mean that's just not going to work. So all of a sudden my workflow just won't run because I've already locked it down to limit what it's able to do. So yeah, least privilege is a good idea. Next tip, use containers. So there's both GitHub Actions and Azure Pipelines have a pretty good story about using containers. Let's have a look at Azure Pipelines first. And here we go. So I've got a pipeline here. It's using containers in 3 different ways. It sort of sounds like a MasterChef sort of thing, doesn't it? Sort of. What I've got here is I've got containers running. This pipeline is running as a container job. It also has a service container, and it's also running a container explicitly. So first of all, the container job is defined here. And that means that rather than just running on the build agent and using whatever is installed on an agent, I'm now going to be downloading, if it's not already on the machine, the Ubuntu 24.04 vanilla image. And that's what I'm going to be running all my tasks inside. And interestingly, that means that I don't have a lot of the things you would normally expect. So it's only what's inside that image. But that's what I've told it I want to do. I've also said I want it to run SQL Server as a separate container. So maybe I'm going to do some integration tests, and I want to have SQL Server available for those tests. I can have that running as a separate container alongside my build. And thirdly, just to show you what you can do, I can then also call docker run and run another container. In this case, it's actually one I've written. It's published on Docker Hub. And it just so happens that if you're familiar with SQL Server, you start up SQL Server, it says I'm running, but if you've ever looked at the log, you can see actually it's doing stuff. It's sorting out the transaction logs, and it's not quite ready for a few seconds. And then eventually you can start querying the databases and it's fine. What this does, it literally keeps pinging the SQL Server saying, are you ready yet? Are you ready yet? And finally it'll say, yes, I am ready.
Does it not find a socket immediately? Or?
It'll get a socket, but it'll try and query a database and that'll fail. And then so it'll wait a few seconds, it'll try again. And then wait a few seconds and try again. As soon as it connects and it gets a response back, then it knows that the SQL Server is ready to do the query.
Seems like a strange design. You just assume, like every other database server, it'll block the socket till it can open the database.
Yeah, it's I guess you could, like Docker containers do have that ability to indicate when they're ready.
Yeah.
And that's not how the SQL Server one has been set up. It really responds to say, yes, I'm SQL Server is running, but that doesn't actually mean that SQL Server itself is ready to respond to database queries.
Yep.
Which, yeah, it's kind of like
Messes up CI.
not a great experience. So I've seen other examples where people have created a custom SQL Server container with they've kind of built this logic into the entry point command sort of thing as well, which is another way of doing it. Or you just make sure you do so many things after starting SQL to when you want to query it, like you might do a build in between, and that will solve the problem because you've just allowed enough time that it works. Yeah, that's right. So so that works. So that we've got 3 different ways of using containers there. So the nice thing is, I wouldn't normally just use a vanilla Ubuntu image here. What this means is that I can have my own custom image there. So if I've got particular tools or libraries that I want to use for building my software or deploying my software, I can create a custom image with just those versions of those tools in that. And then I can be assured that every time I do a deployment or a build, it's going to use the exact same versions. And indeed, my developers could be using that too. Then I can be confident that my developers are building the same way as what it's going to be built on the build server and into production as well, which is kind of nice. In Azure DevOps, that's Azure DevOps. In GitHub, we can do something pretty similar. So again, we've got this ability to run our whole job inside a container. We've also got the ability to run a service container here. So I've got SQL Server. So you can see that we're defining the port. I do have the password there set with a really strong password. And I can run that as well. One difference here is that, and I'll show you this, I think I've still got the run there. A slight difference with how it runs on GitHub. So I find my containers run and it failed. Now the trick is making sure I pick the right one. Oh yeah. Oh, maybe not. It turns out that vanilla Ubuntu image does not contain Docker. So that was one difference really between the two. So that would fail. So if I tried to, I could do other stuff, but if I tried to run Docker, it would say, I don't know what you're talking about. I haven't got that software installed. Why did it work in the Azure pipeline? Well, because, I'm not sure if you noticed, I have a task here to install it there. So that's how it worked there. I didn't find an equivalent task, but I guess the way around that was instead, as I was talking to you before, create a custom image with that tooling installed. So that it is actually, I created this image, which is the vanilla Ubuntu image with the Docker tools installed on top of that. And then this pipeline works. So yeah, you've got that ability to do that.
Does that use Docker and Docker?
Yeah.
D-I-N-D.
Yeah. You can get weird things happening, yes. Yeah, I mean, you can do your builds inside the Docker container and yeah.
I think Docker and Docker is when the container runtime provides the containers with a Docker socket.
Yeah. Ryan, have you got a question? Yeah.
Have you ever run into the pipeline timeouts when you're using containers? So that's something we ran into quite a bit when we were using containers in our pipelines.
Is that, I'll look at this example here. Just because it takes a long time to download them?
Because it takes such a long time to download them.
Yeah.
And then download or install any other software that you then do when it's building up the containers. If you're adding things like, I don't know, Docker into your container.
No, it's a good point. There is a cost to using containers, and that is that if they're not already on the build agent, they've got to download. And not only the time cost, but sometimes it can be literally the cost of downloading the data. Depending on what service you're using, you might be paying for that data as well. So I guess either I mean, the techniques there are either if you've got control over your build agents, if they're self-hosted ones, then you can try and cache those Docker images on the agent so they're already there and you're saving on the download cost. Or you might look at using some kind of Docker repository as like a cache. I've seen that approach where that cache is close to the Azure pipelines, like in the same region or something like that, so that it's going to be pretty quick. But yeah, if that Docker image is changing a lot, then that can be tricky too, because then you're still going to have to be pulling down new changes all the time. So.
You also know, like, if you have self-hosted agents,
Yeah.
sometimes they take a while to get allocated to a job.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So so self-hosted agents can be a bit slower sometimes than the Microsoft ones or the GitHub ones. Yeah, I think it often just depends on how much you're paying for the kind of agent you've got. There's the scale set agents where they spin up new ones as you need them and then shut them down. There's a time to do that. But obviously, again, it's like swings and roundabouts. It's like, do you have them all running all the time so that it starts quicker, but then you're paying for them running all the time? Usually people don't want to pay for stuff that's not being used, so they'll spin them down. Maybe you try and get smarter and spin them up during the day and spin them down at night, or it's tricky, but yeah, often you end up paying for those kind of privileges of having faster build agents as well. But yeah, I think containers really help remove a lot of the variability, especially if you're using Microsoft or GitHub agents. The software on those is changing weekly or monthly. So you can't rely on the same things being there or the same versions of things being there all the time. So using containers means you're more in control over what tools are there and what versions of those tools are there. So definitely worth a look if you can use that. Probably also worth mentioning, if you're doing Windows builds, you can use containers, but it's obviously that the containers are a lot larger just because Windows seems to be a bit less efficient compared to Linux. Yeah, another question.
Patch outside of the pipeline, you kind of leave the pipeline environment and move into a container so that you have your own controlled environment, which is not the pipeline per se.
Yes, the pipeline is still running inside the container or using the container. So it's like you've spun up your container, and now your pipeline is running those tasks inside that container.
So it's not that I'm specifying special like command line code to execute inside the container per se. It's just the pipeline continues running.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Just builds the container around itself.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. So to use a container as a job, it can't be. It needs to be basically a general purpose container, and it needs to have things like Bash and some other fundamental things. So it can't just be a specific. Like you couldn't use SQL Server as your container job, because that container is just running SQL. It's not going to be running .NET Build or anything like that. Yeah, and so that usually means they're going to be based on some kind of Linux distro, if we're talking about Linux. So Ubuntu or Alpine or whatever else. And then usually, depending on what you're doing with it, then you might have some extra tools installed as well for your requirements. I don't know, like .NET SDKs or Java SDKs or Python or whatever else it is you're building. You tend to have that installed as well. So yeah, so it becomes the equivalent of basically a virtual environment that you're running your build inside. So, and rather than, I guess the other problem with like self-hosted build agents is that John's building a .NET framework application and I'm building a .NET framework application, but we're using different versions of .NET framework, like old school. For some reason I'm using .NET 3 because I'm crazy. And John's like on .NET 4.8. And the trouble is, like, if I try and build mine on the machine that's got the newer version of .NET Framework installed, then my stuff builds differently or wrong or something. So you end up having to have different build agents with different configurations. Whereas if we've got a container, I can have one or more agents, but that container is what's controlling the tooling, and it's disposable. I can download it, run it, and then get rid of it, or reuse it as I need to. Yeah, does that make sense? Yeah, cool. So really powerful. I mean, there's a cost of managing it, but it can be really useful.
So would a good use case of containers in CI be, say you've got a Node.js project, and when you restore the dependencies, it needs a bunch of libraries to be installed in the operating system, like FFmpeg.
Like LibreOffice, if you're running a DocChain system that you're building.
Yeah. So
That's definitely never happens.
Yeah, no, that's a good example of those kind of system dependencies that otherwise you'd have to potentially log into the agent and install it, or run an MSI or apt-get install kind of thing. Having that sort of pre-done in a container image means you can do that. And also as a developer, you can use the same container image to build locally as well.
yeah.
So you're getting that consistency across local and build system as well. So, yeah. Okay, next tip, managing dependencies. So kind of two stories here. There may be other options, but these are the ones I'm familiar with, is really Dependable on GitHub and Renovate on everything else. And GitHub too, for that matter. But let's have a look at both of those options. So Dependable is something we can enable in a couple of ways. So there's actually, in the security settings here, we can enable Dependable alerts. I've already got that enabled here. And that'll, at a minimum, that'll just let me know, oh, you're using a NuGet package that's got a security vulnerability. You really should patch that. Then you can go in and say, actually, I want you to tell me about any dependencies I've got, and I want you to create pull requests so that I can upgrade when new versions come out. Not just security, but just when new releases of a package comes out. And so I've done that, and if I click on here, okay, that's the security one, sorry. Configure. So the version updates is the other option. So there's security updates and version updates. So I've got all these enabled already. And in fact, I think in my GitHub settings, I've got it set so that when I create a new repo, these will all be enabled by default. If I go in here and configure this one, I've already done this. This actually commits a file, dependable.yaml. And this is where I can say, these particular package ecosystems, as it calls them, I want you to look for new versions of those packages. So for GitHub Actions, let me know if any of those particular actions in any of my workflows, if new versions of those come out. So when John releases his dodgy one, I'll get a PR that comes up saying, please upgrade to John's dodgy version of the Bitcoin miner task. And the same for NuGet. So if I was using some other packaging system for another language, like Python or Rust or whatever, then potentially Dependable could support that. I'd have to go and check to see if it's a supported one. But if I do that, then I'll get pull requests created automatically, like these ones are here. So you can see that it's recognised that I'm actually using a really old version of newtonsoft.json, and I really should upgrade that to the latest version. And so it's created the pull request for me. There's the change, it's bumped that version number up there. And because it's a pull request, it's also ran any other workflows I've got set up. So I've already got, I've got Sonar Cloud set up here. I went a bit crazy and clicking through all those different static tools before I tried to find out how many I could set up on the same repo. And if I've got other build and test stuff, that would all run here as well. I could even set this up to automatically merge if all those passed, if I wanted to. But yeah, so that generates that automatically. If there's like 1302 comes out, then it'll sort of close or re-update this one to go, actually no, this one's out of date, there's a new one now. So yeah, that Makes it pretty easy for GitHub. What about Azure Pipelines? So in Azure Pipelines, we've got, we don't have Dependabot. I don't know if there's any plans that we ever will. Who knows what the future holds. But there's a third-party tool called Renovate, and it does pretty much the same thing, and it works with a whole bunch of build systems, including Azure DevOps, and it works with a whole bunch of package systems, including NuGet. Seeing as we're here at the .NET user group, that's probably the one of interest to us. So I've got a separate project for this one. It's actually not here, the Renovate demo. So to get Renovate running, normally you just create a pipeline. There's a few different ways of running Renovate. It's an NPM package, and so what I'm using here is actually I'm running it as a Docker container job, as it happens. If we have a look at the pipeline. And so it's set up to run every day, and it's running inside a container. And this is where this container has then got all the stuff pre-installed for me, so I can just run npx renovate, and it's going to do its thing. So if I go back and have a look at an actual run, we'll see that there's this bash task here, and then it's gone and basically I've configured it to look for NuGet files. If I zoom that in a bit, might be better. And it's gone to see, okay, is there any updates here? Well, then there's one for again, this newtonsoft.json. I seem to be making the same mistake every time. But yeah, Renovate's got my back, and it's going to create a pull request just the same. So if I go in here, look at my pull requests, and there they are. And this is interesting. Renovate's actually given me two options. It said either upgrade to 8.03 or upgrade to version 13. So it's sort of figured out there's two options here. Renovate is extremely configurable. There is a couple of things here. There's basically a config.json, and I can add a whole bunch of stuff in here. I've just got the simplest example, but you can be really go to town with how you want it to work and what package systems you want to work with. Yeah, so that's a good one if you've got Azure DevOps and you want to have something similar to Dependabot. Check out Renovate. It's pretty cool. There's even a commercial offering. They're open source on GitHub, but they've got an enterprise version that you can pay for as well. Okay, so you've done all that good work, but things are still going to go wrong. Well, I talk for myself. When I do things and I try and do the best things still go wrong. Maybe you guys have got it all sorted out, but inevitably I find that things change, and it's not always stuff that I've made a problem or made a mistake with, but it might just be other things changing. We talked, like earlier, we talked about those templates. So it might be that someone else changes a template and then our build breaks. Well, how do we diagnose that? Somebody changes or GitHub or Microsoft changes the software that's installed on their hosted agents, and suddenly our build breaks. How do we diagnose that? A really simple thing that I've add to almost every pipeline I create is like a little dump environment. So what I mean by that is literally this. And mainly this one where I'm dumping out the environment variables, because most often they're the things that are going to tell me what's the state of the system. I also have hit a few issues where sometimes the agent's running low on disk space or memory. So I've now settled on having those options in as well. So for a Linux machine, I'm going to get a little status of the memory of that build agent as well as the disk space as well. On GitHub, there's these other context objects, and they also can contain some useful information about the GitHub workflow. Likewise, you can do pretty much the same thing in Azure Pipelines. You don't have those context objects so much, but we do have the ability to print out environment variables, which can be really helpful. Now you might be thinking, why have I got that kind of funny syntax? Why didn't I just do this? Because that seems kind of, that should just work. It does, except for the fact that sometimes some of the variables or environment variables have like line breaks in the values, and that sort then messes those up. I'll see if I can show you what I'm talking about there. If I go back to my build, and no, I didn't figure out that syntax, I just found on Stack Overflow. So maybe I'd use ChatGPT nowadays, but so yeah, either I'd have a separate job that just does this, or so this is the printf one, and I think you get this weird stuff, or it's missing a few things. Whereas if I do that one, see if I can find the, it may not be in here, but I think maybe it's when I do a container job. You get some extra stuff in there because it gives you some information about the Docker containers. But yeah, adding that in can be really invaluable for diagnosing what was the state of this build, because so often you can't just remote into the machine and have a look at it. Ryan?
Do you ever worry about leaking secrets by doing something like that?
Hey, not too much, because normally the secrets should be obfuscated. Unless, and if they're not, it's probably because you forgot to do that. So most build systems have a way of you telling it this is a secret, don't log it. So I don't know if we've got any examples in here. We probably don't.
Worst cases, you can rotate the secrets after debugging.
Yeah. But yeah, so I know for both of these systems, there's ways of telling them this text here, that's a secret. Don't show that in logs, just put asterisks or something like that. John?
So here's a curveball.
Yeah.
So in Git, have you heard of there's a command called bisect?
Yes.
That you can use to find bugs?
Yeah.
Is there a way to use bisect to debug CI? Or to find a bug that was introduced in CI, because you'd have to somehow get the remote repository into that state.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. Because yeah, bisect locally, you can automate it to run stuff and find when things like pass or fail.
Yep, but locally you can't run the CI pipeline or...
Yeah. That's a really interesting idea. I haven't heard of that. The closest is, it's not using bisect, it's just like doing a manual binary search kind of thing. Okay, it works here, it didn't work there, go in the middle and do it that way. But yeah, let's see if there's a dump in here. There is, okay. There we go. So yeah, when we use containers, we get this extra data here, and so that's got like a JSON value. And if I just use the print end sort, that would all get messed up and I wouldn't know what was going on. So yeah. But yeah, I guess a little tip there, if you are doing stuff with Docker containers and you want to know what the names of the containers are, then you can use this to figure out, oh, there's that service container called MSSQL and there's the actual ID of that container. So if you need to know that. Bonus tip. Okay, testable pipelines. This one again, I just find myself doing this to pretty much every pipeline I write now. And it's kind of inspired by PowerShell. So PowerShell, you might be familiar with the commandlets. A lot of them have a what if option where you can do sort of, I don't know, write or set content to a file with a dash what if. It'll run the commandlet, but it won't actually make the change. It'll say, I was going to do this. I'm letting you know I would have done it, but you said what if, so I'm not actually going to make the change. I'm just telling you what I would have done. And I find that ability to use this in pipelines is quite valuable. especially when you've got a pipeline that might actually make significant changes, but you want to test out the logic of your pipeline, make sure you haven't made any dumb typos, and especially if you're using those each directives or conditionals, you want to test that out without actually necessarily deploying the software or making an actual change. So having a what if parameter can help us with that. And we can do that in both of these. So let's have a look at a what if example. So we're going to add a parameter. So we add a parameter block at the top of our pipeline. I just call it what if, give it a nice display name. It's a Boolean. And then I can set up a conditional here. I can either use a condition property like this, or I can actually use an expression like this, which means that if basically removes that whole block from the run if it's not true. So yeah, so that logic there could be something like update a database or spend $1,000 or some kind of thing that might be a regular part of your pipeline, but when you're testing it, you don't want to mess those things up, and having that what if can be really helpful. Yeah, we can do a similar thing in GitHub Actions, so we can have it's a different way of doing a parameter, but when we manually run a workflow in GitHub, it's called a workflow dispatch, and then we can set up a parameter there, and then I've got a condition here on this step as well. So yeah. Yeah, so do you need to remember to put it everywhere? Yes, so it's not just a magic thing of put the parameter in and then it figures it out. You do have to then look at each step and go, okay, is this spending $1,000? Is this writing data into my database? Yes, okay, I better put the condition in there to check that if it's a what if or not. So, and it's not bulletproof because you might still make a mistake when you're doing that. But yeah, so I've used this where I've got some PowerShell, and so I might, in a script task, and so I might have a what if to say, okay, if it's a what if, then just output, I would have done this SQL query, but otherwise do the actual SQL query if it's not true. So yeah, so you've still got to write the logic to work it in. It's not, yeah, you've got to add it in. So there's a bit of an overhead there, but yeah, then you're going to benefit from that to be able to use that later on if you need to test the pipeline. Right.
Do you found any of the existing actions support what if? Because I know when you've done PowerShell, it's actually such a no-brainer to do because you just pass it through to everything else. Yeah, it's true. PowerShell kind of has it built in. No, this is really something you just got to adopt as a process. That if it's useful, then you've got to do that. And so you've got to wrap all the actions you've got to wrap yourself in your own conditions.
Yeah. So either adding that condition to decide whether to run this or not, or include it inside. If it's a script thing, then figuring out, do I need to have some if-else kind of logic there as well. So, yeah.
Do commands at least fail if you provide a what if parameter that they were not expecting?
It depends what you're trying to do, yeah. So, I mean, sometimes it might be tricky to avoid, like, a what if might not be possible because then I don't know, if it's like a database query or a query in the state of infrastructure, you may not be able to avoid doing that because the rest of your pipeline pretty much depends on that. So I guess it's something just to weigh up. Can I use it here, or does it end up that my what if means pretty much the pipeline doesn't do anything at all? That's not so useful. But other times when you do have some conditional logic, or you just want to test it and just make sure that your logic is correct, it can be useful for that. So, yeah.
I was just worried about the scenario where you thought you implemented what if, but you actually didn't.
Yeah.
So you say what if is true, and
Yeah.
it silently just makes permanent changes.
Yeah,
instead
I'm
of failing straight away with that.
Yeah, I'm trying to think whether it will, if you haven't actually defined it as a parameter, whether that will flag as an error or not. I can't remember.
I don't believe it does.
I think
any
it
parameter
may-
action passing. I think
it may just resolve to empty. So yeah, something to watch out for. Yeah, it's not perfect. Yeah. Okay, here's an interesting one. When we're deploying our software with our pipelines, often we're using some kind of logging or telemetry or diagnostics as well. In Azure, it might be App Insights or Log Analytics. It could be some third-party logging tool like Splunk or Datadog or something like that. So being able to track when you've done a new release and tie that into that logging data, it can be quite useful. In Azure, and I should have logged into Azure, I forgot to. If you're deploying an app service or an Azure function or a few other things using one of the in Azure Pipelines tasks, this actually does it for you. So I've got an App Insights instance here. And I did do a deploy. That's going to be interesting trying to find this. And it only shows up under certain things. But basically, when the pipeline does a deploy, it adds some extra, an annotation in the data. So if I do last 3 days. Oh yeah, there we go. So see that little arrow there? That was my release. So that's kind of useful because I could potentially do a new release and then I get all these errors and I go, okay, I think there's a problem with my release. Or maybe performance changes, like, I don't know, CPU goes up or down, whatever. So really useful. And I guess the idea is, depending on whatever system you've got, see if there's a way to do that. The built-in Azure Pipelines tasks do this for you, but there's also, I know for App Insight, there's an API you can call, and they actually, in the docs, here's some PowerShell to do this as well, and I've done that for infrastructure. So I was doing a Terraform deployment, and I wanted to tag the App Insights, okay, that deployment's now complete. Or Kubernetes is another example where I've done a Kubernetes deployment. We're still using App Insights for our logging, and I wanted to tag, okay, our new version is now running, and I can tie that in. So yeah, either use the built-in tasks or use the scripting and use the API to push that annotation in. You can customize what data appears there as well. So in this case, it's just that text there, but you can provide extra data there. I think it's kind of cool and useful. Okay, and I think we're getting close to the end here. We've deployed our software, but do we know what version is running where? So we've got our, I don't know, dev, test, UAT, SUT, however other many non-prod environments. We might have the one just before prod, and then the one almost before prod, and then we've got prod. But what version is running in each of those environments? If you're using Azure Pipelines, the old classic release pipelines had a pretty good visual page that would show you what version was there. If you're using some other kind of deployment tool like Octopus, has a really nice dashboard to show you what version is deployed where. If you're using Azure Pipelines, you're kind of out of luck. So we've got the pipelines view, which just tells you which pipeline ran. That doesn't tell me what version's where. We've got environments, and normally you would use an environment to indicate I'm going to target dev or test or prod, and that's the name of the environment and deploying to that. So I've got environment 1, 2, 3 here. But those dates, that's not right. Like, I've deployed stuff more recently than that. I can drill in here. But there's all this different stuff that's not really that useful. At least it's got some times. But so wouldn't it be nice if there was some kind of extension for Azure DevOps? I don't know, let's call it a deployment dashboard, just for a name, that would give us that information. Well, hey, hang on. There's something there called deployment dashboard. Let's have a look at it. Let's give it a go. So this is actually an extension that some of my colleagues and I worked on initially as a bit of a hackathon project, because we'd had this problem. We worked with clients and we wanted to use the YAML pipelines, but we didn't have a way to visualize where things were deployed and what versions they had. So we worked on this a couple of years ago, And then more recently, we thought, actually, let's polish this up and get it out there so people can use it. So we did that. It's now in the marketplace. You can install it on your own Azure DevOps install. And that's exactly what it does. We've got our environments here. We've got our pipelines here. And I can see that this pipeline here has been deployed into those 3 environments. This one, whoop, lost my mouse. Oh, that's right. Do I go back or forward? I think I'll go back there. Don't be worried the fact that I've got 2 here. That's just because I've got the developer version installed, so I get an extra one, but normally you just get the one. And then I can drill in and actually have a look at that deployment. There it is. There's that build. I've even got settings, so I can actually, one of these, I don't know if you realise, but dev, test, prod, it's not alphabetical order. So often your test would end up the wrong way around. So we did actually build a little screen here so you can reorder stuff, and I want that to go there or something, I don't know. Maybe I want that one, I don't know. And I can save that and go back. So you can reorder the environment, so that makes sense. This is open source on GitHub, and we've got a few other ideas of how we could improve it even more and make it more customizable. Yeah, having that ability to understand quickly what version is installed where is really useful. We haven't got a version for GitHub. GitHub's quite a different environment. For one, you can't extend the UI like you can in Azure DevOps. So there is no ability to add in an extra menu item in GitHub. To do something like this, we'd have to build some kind of app that integrates with GitHub. So it's not impossible, but it's quite a different kind of solution. So, but yeah, for now, that just sort of solved a problem we were experiencing, and yeah, kind of cool. I should stop doing that.
So Dave, sorry, how did you tie the release back to a particular version of source?
So the question, so how do I know what's released where? Yeah, so we're calling API calls to figure it out. So I'm trying to think how the logic works. We loop over we can figure out the environments, and we can figure out what pipelines there are, and then we query the environment. We can get Azure DevOps to tell us all the deployments that have targeted that environment, and then we just remember the most recent one for that pipeline. So yeah, I guess things that we could do in the future are things like, you haven't released to environment 3 here, but it's waiting on an approval or something like that, so we could put that in there as well. Yeah, we've had some people it turns out they've got like hundreds of pipelines, and I think our first release, we weren't actually checking that if there was more data to get. We were just getting like the first 50 or something like that. So yeah, that's interesting when you see other people use it and you think, oh, I didn't even think of that. So yeah, or even the fact that I think this is possibly not the actual, like you can customize the build number when you're doing a build in Azure Pipelines. Well, we're not actually using that here yet, but we could, but that wouldn't be another API call to get that data back. So yeah, and it all runs in your browser, so there's nothing server-side. It's just actually JavaScript calling those API calls just as the rest of Azure DevOps UI does. So yeah. Yeah. Okay. And with that, that's our 10 tips done. I think there was even more than 10 today, but some links there to the source repo, to that Renovate demo as well, and also a link to the annotations. If you're working with App Insights, there's info there on how to do that with the PowerShell as well. But yeah, my top 10 tips to avoid getting grey hair too early when you're working with GitHub and Azure DevOps. So yeah, any other questions with that, John.
When would you choose between using Azure DevOps or GitHub Actions? Is there certain scenarios where one is better than the other?
Yeah, so I think Microsoft have kind of they've kind of messed up a bit here with trying to figure out what they're doing. Like they bought GitHub, and then GitHub Actions came out, and it looked a lot like Azure Pipelines, and then it was like, oh, okay, well then Azure DevOps is kind of dead. We'll just everyone should go to GitHub. But the problem was that GitHub wasn't really set up for enterprise use. And a lot of people are still using Azure DevOps, and it's like, well, we don't want to move. And even Microsoft themselves use Azure DevOps a lot. In fact, I think they're probably one of the biggest users of it. So I think the story's changed a bit, but I think now it's kind of settled down. And in fact, for a while there, they weren't really doing much with Azure DevOps either. Like, it's like, well, nothing's changing here, it's just the odd security fix. I think that's changed now that, okay, there's actual feature work being done on Azure DevOps. Not a lot, but it's getting worked on because people still need it to work, and they need improvements to solve certain problems as well. GitHub, however, is probably the more favourite child, I suppose, maybe. So it's not that Azure DevOps has been forgotten now, but that's where a lot more effort's been put into. So you'll see that there's improvements coming out for GitHub Actions, for the GitHub projects / sort of work item kind of stuff there. And then that was certainly something that was lacking a lot. So if I had a choice, I would prefer for building stuff, I would prefer to use GitHub, to be honest. But if I'm using Azure Pipelines, that's okay. But yeah, if I could have both, that's even another option. And that, I guess that's what I've demonstrated here. Is I've got a GitHub repo and I'm using Azure Pipelines against it. So there's that sort of hybrid mode is also valid. I think they're still trying to sort out the licensing and the billing side of things. That theoretically it should just be like, okay, we've paid our money, we want to just use whichever tool we want. I think they're still trying to, because GitHub was a separate company, I think they're still figuring stuff out there of how the two systems talk to each other and all that kind of thing. But yeah, I like the flexibility that GitHub Actions gives me to be able to easily write custom actions and do that in line. I don't have to go through the whole extension thing to do that. But yeah, on the other hand, we couldn't write a dashboard like that. So I guess they're different systems for different purposes. So yeah, if you're using Azure DevOps, don't feel bad. Don't feel under stress that you need to move. But if it's a choice that you're making now about which system to look at, if all other things being equal, I'd lean towards GitHub. So yeah.
Not so much about the pipelines. I'm just interested to find someone that uses Renovate and Dependable. What's like the business processes you work around it with? Like, do you do it passed all the CI tests, let it merge and upgrade, or do you actually, make a copy and clone that and test it and everything?
Yeah, so yeah, sort of using those dependency tools. I think my answer depends a bit also on what application I'm working on. So I've got a bunch of open source stuff on GitHub, which uses Dependabot. And a lot of those I actually set up to just automatically take the PRs from Dependabot and upgrade themselves. Sometimes I may let it merge in to main, but not actually do a release. I'll still then manually go in and go, okay, everything's working. I'll create a release of that, and depending on what it is, then that becomes the next sort of public version of it, even though the source code is referencing that. For sort of work-based stuff, I'm probably a bit more conservative there, and the work-based stuff tends to be more on the Azure DevOps side of things. And yeah, I guess it also depends on what it is too. So I've got it set up on some projects where it's just doing one PR at a time, and so that means it's a lot easier to figure out because something might build and a test might pass, but then you deploy it and then it breaks because it's now running in a cloud or something like that. So that's kind of easy to figure out. Oh, okay, this is broken. The other things, and I think Renovate can do a better job of this, is often, and I think Dependable's getting better at this, is that grouping changes together. XUnit's a good example where XUnit might have a new version come out, and there's also a new version of the xunit.visualstudio.whatever. And really you should do both of them together because one depends on the other. And it used to be that they'd create one and that would fail and you have to go in and manually update it to make sure they're all updating together. Yeah, so I don't know, yeah, I'm probably a bit more conservative with work stuff. Do you use them or?
Yeah, we use Renovate.
Yep.
DevOps. And yeah, it's like on their websites, but then it's like, oh, just let it go. Like, but yeah, we absolutely are the same as you. It's just like, okay, like it'll make a new PR once a week with a bunch of changes.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, someone's going to check this out and build up locally and check that it all runs there. And then it goes through a regular testing and the release cycle of it.
Yeah, I like that, and I like you're treating them pretty much the same as a PR from a developer in that respect. That
PR from a pretty junior developer that kind of just throws stuff together without really knowing what it's doing.
Yeah. And I mean, I've done the same thing myself. Like, oh, this is out of date. Okay, I'm just going to go into VS and the NuGet thing and just upgrade everything. And okay, it compiles, ship it, and then discover that everything's broken because you've upgraded things beyond what they're supposed to be upgraded, or the major version changes and that kind of thing. So, yeah.
What you mentioned, just if anyone else considering it, like Renovate's configuration is insane. Like you can make it do literally anything. It's like, I want 2 specific versions changed, only to a maximum of 1 minor 2 patch versions, and I'd like that done at 7:39 p.m.
Yeah. No, I've set up, and even when I set up this demo, it didn't work straight away. You can see that from some of my pipelines. It's fail, pass. Just trying to get the config right, and why isn't this working? And it's working here. It looks the same. What's different? So, but yeah, Renovate is quite a powerful tool, and it seems to support a whole lot of ecosystems and package things. So, it's pretty clever. But treating them as PRs that need to be looked at and considered just like any other code change. And if that means maybe you don't have the right kind of tests in place, that you might have to write some more tests to sort of, I mean, sometimes that you just make assumptions that the framework kind of things are just going to work, and sometimes they don't. So, yeah.
I also noticed it submitted your PRs as you.
Yes, because I gave it my personal access token.
So you can give it a separate one so it appears as a separate thing like the Pentapod did.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. So I set it up to run as me, but I have set it up to run as the build service. So that's how I would do it, and that means it's then rather than having to generate a personal access token, I can just use the system.access token. I do have to do a bit of extra work there because you've got to grant the build service the right permissions. Normally the build service isn't allowed to commit changes back to the Git repo. And I don't think it can create pull requests by default. So you do have to go in and grant it extra permissions to let that work. So they're the kind of things where you might go, hey, can I do that? Or maybe I don't have the ability to do that. That's locked down too much. So, but I could use a personal access token. But yeah, if I can, that's my preference. Or if you've got the ability to have a separate dedicated service account that does those kind of operations to distinguish that from me doing something, is kind of nicer. Whereas yeah, on GitHub, Dependabot gets its own little thing. So yeah, good point. Yeah. Any questions or comments? No, cool. All right. Thanks everyone. I hope you got something out of that that you can apply to the stuff you work on. And yeah, appreciate you coming along tonight. Thanks very much.